Thanks, Ruby. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session on business models for open access books, and we're introducing a new online collection. My name is Lucy Barnes, and I am an editor and outreach coordinator at Open Book Publishers. OBP is a non-profit, scholar-led, independent open access book publisher based in the UK. And before I sort of set the scene for today's session, I'd like to thank OASPA for hosting us. And the webinar series sponsors, the Royal Society of Chemistry and ATIPON. OASPA has a full programme of webinars this year and is a small not-for-profit organisation and relies on the support of its members, sponsors and conference delegates to do everything that it does. Welcome to everybody out there online. We've got over 460 registered participants today, and I think almost 200 live attendees, which is great. Registrants are from all over the world and from 47 countries. North America and the UK make up just over half of the total, and the remainder are spread across the world, which is particularly great for us because one of the things that I want to talk about is the sort of geographical diversity that we want to try and represent in this collection. Attendees come from approximately 350 different organisations. Half are from academic institutions, with a large majority of academic libraries, a large contingent from all types and sizes of publisher, and a smaller number of consortia, governmental organisations, services, associations, funders, and non-profits or charities, amongst others. And past webinars can be found on the OASPA webinar site at the address on the slide. And a link to the recording of today's webinar will be found there soon as well. Without further ado, I'd like to sort of set the scene really for the collection and hopefully to share my slides, if that's okay, Ruby. So hopefully everybody can see that there. So the collection that I'm introducing today is a collection of business models of different open access book presses. And the collection itself is available to view on PubPub, and you can see the link there in the slide. And Bernie, if it can go in the chat as well, that would be great. So I wanted to share a little bit about how this collection came together and what we're hoping it will achieve. And then after that, I want to hand over to my colleagues who are with me on the call today, who are from a number of different presses who have contributed to the collection. And I will introduce those colleagues of mine shortly. But the collection basically stemmed from a blog post that I wrote in May 2020. And this was a post that sort of laid out Open Book Publishers' business model in a certain amount of detail and with quite a lot of transparency. And the reason that I wrote that post initially was because it was something that we'd wanted to kind of share in a fair amount of detail with the world, because you know, obviously there's a great amount of interest in open access book publishing at the moment, but particularly at the time that I wrote the post, in the UK, there was a funder who was putting together an open access policy, and there was some discussion about whether or not this policy would include open access books. And a lot of the conversation concerned how this could be funded if it would be done. You know, how would we be able to afford open access books? And particularly, the discussion seemed to assume that the book processing charge was the only model that would be available. And this was particularly frustrating for us at OBP because we haven't used a book processing charge, and therefore we were well aware that it was possible to do this in other ways that weren't being discussed. And so I wrote this blog post and published it in May 2020. And then Francois got in touch with me, Francois and Schalkwyk from African Minds, to say that he'd read this blog post and was interested in it, but he was also interested in some of the differences between OBP and the way that we do things and African Minds and their model. And so out of our discussions, we sort of decided it might be worthwhile to draw a collection together with different presses from different geographical contexts, different maybe institutional contexts, you know, with different ways of publishing and different ways of running their presses, to sort of try and demonstrate, you know, some of the diversity that does exist in terms of funding open access books and open access book publishers and how they run. And then, so we started to reach out at that point to other presses via email. Of course, this is in the middle of the pandemic. And so, you know, several presses were interested and were able to contribute to the collection, which we were delighted by. There were also some presses who at that point weren't able to contribute at that point, and hopefully at some point in the future more presses will want to contribute to this collection, because, you know, one of the points that I want to make about it is that it's, you know, it's hopefully going to be a developing collection. So we have a number of presses currently represented, and hopefully there will be more in the future. And part of the collection was gathered by Operas. So last year, Operas did a project documenting innovative business models for open access books. And so they gathered a number of case studies. Agatha Morka at Operas heard that I was putting together this collection and thought that this might be a good home long term for the case studies that were gathered by Operas. And so we're delighted that they're included. And the intention of the collection, as I've said, is to document the diverse business models that underpin the work of different open access book publishers. And we wanted the collection to show the why as well as the how. So it's one thing to present you with several business models that open access book presses are using, but what we hope the collection gets across is some of the reasons why some of the decisions have been made, why certain structures may have been chosen, why certain strategies may have been chosen, and, you know, to sort of to show that it's not just, you know, a straightforward thing, I'm going to publish a book, it's going to be open access, but there might be different reasons why organizations do it in a particular way. And I'm really pleased to say that the collection does have a certain amount of geographical diversity within it. So if I've done my maths correctly, there are currently 3 continents and 9 countries represented in the collection. As I mentioned, we have a contribution from Operas, and so there's a large chunk of those contributions are European countries, which is great. But if you are a press from a non-European country and you are interested in contributing to the collection, then please let me know. If you're from a European country, we would also be interested to hear from you, but particularly I'd like to try and expand the diversity of what's available in the collection beyond Europe if possible. And we hope that the collection will be there for anyone who's interested in open access book publishing for whatever reason. So it might be that you're interested in potentially setting up a press of your own. It might be that you want to know more about some of the different ways that open access book publishers fund their work, maybe if you're a librarian or if you're potentially an author of an open access book. If you're a policymaker, which was kind of where the seed of this began, I suppose, or if you're a researcher who's interested in you know, contemporary scholarly communications and open access publishing. And as I said, this is hopefully going to be a growing collection. So on the collection itself, I've included a template of how we put these case studies together, and mine and Francois' contact details. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, potentially to contribute to the collection, then that would be great, and we would love to hear from you. So having gone through that, I will unshare my slides and introduce today's speakers. So today we have Francois van Schalkwyk of African Minds, who'll be speaking first. Then Beth Bluecross of Amherst College Press and Libre Press, Julian Mccarty of Mattering Press, and Vincent van Gerven of Punctum Books. And each person is going to talk about their press, hopefully about the reasons why they wanted to contribute to the collection. And once you've heard from all these amazing speakers, we'll then move into a Q&A section. So you'll be able to drop questions in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to address those at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Francois now. Thanks, Francois.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. I'm going to just try and share my screen, hopefully without any issues. Okay, I might be looking a bit sideways because my camera's on one computer and my presentation's on another, so apologies for that. So I think that before I get going, I think I'd just like to say, to add to what Lucy said, that we've got 10 minutes, I think, to present, which is not a lot, but we've written up our cases, and there's a lot more detail and a lot more richness in those cases. So I would encourage people to go and read them if they have time. But also, what's exciting for me to participate is to hear the questions that might come at the end. What have we left out? What are we not saying? Lucy said that we want to try and be as transparent as possible. So we want to answer all questions that may be out there. So I'll go through my presentation fairly quickly. And then hopefully if there are any gaps, we can address those in the questions that follow. So maybe a little bit of background on African Minds. We're an fully open access scholarly book publisher. We're based in Cape Town in South Africa. We've been operating formally since 2012. And I say formally because there were some books published prior to that, and you can read more about that sort of backstory in the blog post. Why we wanted to participate in this? I mean, my very initial reason for contacting Lucy and suggesting this. Well, I mean, books are still important. In some disciplines, less so. We know that. In others, they remain important. And I was talking to a colleague the other day who's a historian, which is, a foreign world to me, but was surprised by how important books still were, and book reviews in particular. I had no idea, the power of the book review in history. So books remain important, and open access is less well practiced, less well known in the book world. Journals capture a lot of their attention, but we wanted to create some space around books and how that possibly can work. We also wanted to point out that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to publishing books open access. That there's variety, and I'm sure there are many models that will still evolve. And the idea of bringing the group of us together is to show the differences and to see how it's being done in different contexts. And we can't move away from context completely. There might be some generic principles or universal principles in open access books, but there's certain context differences that are equally important. And of course, we'd like to attract new open access publishers to the ecosystem. I mean, I don't know, I think we may be a bit unique in that sense. We always seem to want more, not fewer publishers. We anti being bought out and becoming bigger and bigger. We like to be small, and I think diversity is valued in this group at least. So our particular context, which is obviously very different from others, and I've differentiated this into two parts. We're based in South Africa, and so inevitably a lot of our authors come from South Africa, and so there are certain contextual conditions that are specific to South Africa. And those are, for example, that there's some institutional support for open access. Some universities are starting to create funds for open access publications, books and journals. So that's important to note. They're not very generous. I don't think they always understand the cost of books versus the cost of a journal article. I think they're far more familiar with open access page fees in the journal world, but hopefully again that's an educational process and will change. There are a lot of funded research projects, either by the National Research Foundation in South Africa or from foreign projects. So there's collaboration between South Africa and overseas universities where there might be research funding available. And that's an important dimension for our books, as you'll see a bit later. And then uniquely South African, as far as I know, is our bizarre government publication subsidy scheme. So if you publish as a university, you get money from government. That's as straightforward as that. I mean, there's some rules and regulations to ensure quality, and there's a whole submission process. But the crude version is you submit annually your list of publications and you get a bunch of money as a university for those publications. And then each university decides how to distribute that money. There's no prescription. So some keep it, some hand it out to the authors. There are all sorts of mechanisms. So that's important in our context because it means that publishing generates income for universities. There's a sort of a feedback loop, as it were, which is not only reputational. It has financial implications too. In Africa, it's a little bit different, and it's quite important for us not to only be a South African publisher, to extend into Africa and create a venue for African academics to publish. There's very little institutional support for open access, if any, and a lot of the funded projects are in STEM fields rather than in the humanities, so where books are not that important. So that makes it a particular challenge for us working with academics in Africa. So I would describe our model at the high level as a hybrid model, but not in the journal sense where we have paywalled and some open access, but in the sense that we have some, what you would call in journal terms, gold open access and some diamond open access. So, I mean, most of you on this call are probably familiar with that. In the case of gold open access, there are page fees to be charged with book processing charges. So there are upfront payments, and that allows us to make the books available open access. But we also know, given our reality and our context, that not everyone has access to funding. And if we only did gold, we'd only be publishing those that have access to resources. And that would create some asymmetries in our publishing program. So we do publish some diamond open, what I call diamond open access, where there are no charges involved. And these are just two examples. And And I deliberately chose the one gold open access because the money for that particular publication came from Bergen University, so it was very generously funded, and that even allows us to cross-subsidize, some other publications. The one on the right is by an academic from University of Nairobi. We certainly didn't have any access to funding, and so we paid the costs on that particular publication. So in the interest of transparency, this is what it costs to publish with African Minds. This is an example. We don't have a standard list of fees. We don't have a rate per page or a rate per book. Instead, we rather treat each book on its own terms, as it were, because we know books differ widely. Something that's text only with no images, no graphs, no tables is much easier to work on than something that's very intensive in that regard. Similarly, edited collections with referencing is a nightmare because no one ever follows our house style, whereas monographs tend to be a little bit easier to manage. So some books cost less than others. That's really what it boils down to. But this is a fairly standard or typical book that I've included. It is a monograph. It's called Understanding Higher Education, and you can see that we break it down by item for the author so that they can see. Often this is important for the institutions. If they present the costs to the institutions, that they can see each item. Sometimes people look at the total and think, oh, that's quite a lot for a book. But when you see the breakdown and you realize what goes into producing the book, then it makes it a little bit more explicit. It's a bit like a credit card statement. The total always looks big, but there's no big item. But when you add it all up, it's always more than you think. So we break it down as much as possible. There can be some variability in the rates for typesetting, for example, straightforward books versus more complicated books. The same with proofreading and indexing. Indexing is always a strange one, always a debate with our authors whether we index or not. It seems that some traditional librarians like indexes, and other authors don't care for them because they say the books are all available as PDFs and you can just search them, so why waste the paper, as it were. But anyway, this one, we included an index in the costs. You'll also see in this quotation or estimate right at the bottom, it says 15% for indirect costs. That's also important for our model. We don't have any full-time staff, but we do have 3 contract staff, and we need to pay them. And so those costs plus other annoying costs like having to be audited every year and paying for website hosting and other regulatory and admin tasks, that comes out of the 15% indirect costs. So that covers our overheads pretty much. And without that, we wouldn't be able to pay for those particular fees.
Sorry to interrupt, Francois. Just to confirm, is that in South African rands, the currency?
Sorry, I should have made that clear. Yeah, it's in South African rands, not in pound sterling. That would have been a bit scary. Yeah, this is definitely in South African rands. So to give you, if you want to do a rough calculation, I think to dollars, US dollars, divide by 15. If you want to get to pounds, divide by 20. And euro, if you know your 17.24 table, then it's divided by, work on 17. That's roughly the exchange rate at the moment, to give you a sense of how this compares to costs elsewhere. Then just quickly on distribution, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for us, that is the key part, is opening as many channels as possible for the books. That includes print and digital, so we're not purely digital. We sell print books, not many, but people still want the paper copies, and we feel that we should be able to make those available. What's frustrating for us is to make those available in Africa is very difficult because of costs of and reliability of sending books around the continent. It's much easier for me to get a book to someone in Belgium than it is in Burkina Faso, and that's a pity. But we keep exploring. The dream is still some kind of distributed printing model in Africa, but that hasn't. There've been attempts, but it hasn't really succeeded yet. Then just to mention in closing that we do explore co-publications. So this is just one example, but we've done 3 others where we will co-publish open access books. Can be difficult with commercial publishers because they always want a non-commercial license, and we prefer to go as open as possible. It is one case where we might compromise on the sort of restrictiveness of the open access license, but it will remain open access. Now, logic here, you might say, well, what's the point? When everyone divides up territories and sells print books, that makes sense. That doesn't make sense when there are no boundaries or no geographical territories anymore. we just see it in network terms. You know, we have access to certain networks and other publishers have access to different networks. And so if we co-publish, we reach more people. And that's the ultimate aim, is to make the books as widely accessible as possible. And I'm going to leave it there. I don't know how I did for time, but hopefully it was short and sweet.
Thanks, Francois. That was great. And next to speak is Beth Bluecross from Amherst College Press and Libre Press.
Hi, everyone. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, I can see that. Thanks.
Wonderful. So yeah, I'm Beth Bluecross. I am from both Libre Press and Amherst College Press, but I will get into that a little bit as we learn more about both of these platinum open access presses, sometimes called Diamond as well. And we have, up until quite recently, shared staff for Libre Press and Amherst College Press, with all of our back-end work being done at Michigan Publishing Services at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And we are both library funded. So the models are similar but slightly different. So we're both completely library funded, but of course Amherst College Press, located in Massachusetts in the US, is funded completely by Amherst College. Whereas Libre Press is a consortium now of 44 campuses in the US, and they are spread out from California to Maine, and really involve now a lot of different types of colleges. It started out just with small liberal arts colleges, which is a real US kind of thing. But now we have expanded to open membership up to the larger comprehensive universities as well for Libre. I'll get in a little bit more to the model for membership as we go on. So first I'll talk a little bit about Amherst College Press, which is open access, digital first, and all peer reviewed, which is the case as well for Libre. There are never any fees to our authors or their institutions. This is something that we have been really adamant about. We actually will not accept direct subventions from somebody's institution. For Libre Press, for Amherst, we'll consider it to offset costs. We have one project right now that needs to be hand coded for the EPUB, which of course almost doubles the production costs for the project. And so we are looking for funding in that case, either from the institution or from outside sources. So for Amherst College Press, we're a small college, it's a small liberal arts college, and we really wanted to be sort of relevant on campus. And we really built our lists around campus strengths and centers. So for example, there's a Center for Russian Studies. So we have acquired in Reese Studies. We have a jazz series because music is an important area for Amherst College. We acquired literary studies because that as well is something that is really core to the campus. And we have a very small but incredibly well sort of curated art museum on campus as well. So we do acquire in art history and visual studies. And one of our partnerships that we have just signed an MOU for and will produce our first title for in this catalog season will be a co-publishing partnership with the Vera List Center at the New School in New York City. And so we're hoping, again, I agree that I think it makes a lot of sense actually to do with what sort of Francois was saying, that it's not about, of course, book sales for us necessarily. We will sell print copies of the books, but we really tap into this large audience that they have at the Vera List Center and also at the New School. And it brings us new readers, new types of events that we can have in a new geographic location. So we're really excited in particular about that partnership. So here are some of our recent titles in these areas. In literary studies, we're really looking at things like what are the boundaries of literature. So for example, a lot in digital literature, we have this now video game art reader. That's another partnership that is now up and running. This is the 4th volume. And so one thing I really want to note, because I love this concept that Lucy mentions about scaling small, we are not going to, have twice as much staff or produce twice as many books. But what I really do want to sort of get out into the world is that a lot of people in the traditional university press publishing community in terms of books had a lot of concern about these books are never going to get attention, they won't get reviewed, maybe they'll get used, but they won't have sort of the same prestige as a lot of other university press books. And I think now, as the field has changed so much and so many presses do have open access initiatives, and there's all these wonderful smaller presses like us, that we are getting attention. This is our first review in the New York Review of Books, and so I think that those days are long gone in terms of OA books not getting the type of attention that they deserve. So as I mentioned, we were also staffing the acquisitions and administrative function for Lever Press as well. And we are using Michigan Publishing Services for all our back-end work, as does Lever Press. Starting April 1st of this year, everything will be moved over to Michigan Publishing Services for Lever Press. So they will also host the acquisitions and admin functions completely from their side. It's been really great to work with them and to work with their platform Fulcrum, which is allowing us to have media-rich digital books. We have some more intense digital projects in the pipeline that they've built functionality for. So it's been mutually beneficial in terms of we'll propose a project to them or what authors would like to do, and then they build that functionality in the platform to sort of expand what is possible within the e-reader itself. And these are just pulled, these are a moment in time. So it really varies, of course, depending on the time of day you pull these maps. And these are one moment in time for Lever titles, but we have really, really strong readership all over the globe. And I think that is something that has just been so compelling to these potential member libraries. We don't have issues with print distribution, for example. We do POD for all of our titles. Very few titles do actual offset print runs. But as you can see, it really has been sort of I come from traditional university press publishing, and it has been astonishing for me, the usage numbers and also the reach of some of these titles. And so in terms of the actual usage numbers, we have one title, for instance, with over 100,000 uses at this point. We're averaging for a traditional sort of monograph in the 10 to 20,000 uses range for some titles. These are across platforms. So our primary usage tends to be on Fulcrum itself, but those statistics are from all the different platforms where our books are available. And those books, I mean, again, coming from traditional university press publishing, some of those books I would have requested 150 copy print run, and now they're getting 20,000 uses. I mean, the first time I was getting these usage reports, I was just astonished. And so, in that sense, I'm really happy I drank the OA Kool-Aid and made this jump to this new and exciting world. So we do work really hard in terms of those usage numbers to make our titles as discoverable as possible. And so we have a librarian at Michigan Publishing Services who is in charge of sending these out really to many different platforms, to making sure that they get in the right places. So we get the appropriate usage for all the titles. And there's a large focus at the Michigan Publishing Services Fulcrum team to make the titles as accessible as possible. So we include alt text, we have transcripts if there's audio-visual material as well, and they have a whole task force to make sure that we're staying on top of everything we need to in terms of accessibility. We've also tried to make the titles as flexible as possible, so to make sure all of the multimedia has DOIs, that people can access that in different ways. that people can access our titles on different devices, different readers. We make both a PDF and EPUB available whenever possible for all of our titles. And so just a couple more words, I suppose, about the sort of logistics of both of the presses. The Lever Consortium model is based on IPEDs, so is based on these national statistics. So it's not one cost for all different types of universities. We couldn't ask the same for a small liberal arts college as we could UCLA, for example. So the cost ranges from $5,000 US to $12,000 US to become a member of Lever Press. Of course, this is a very different type of model than the MIT model or some other models where you get the backlist or other titles. We have nothing to give. So you have to really do this in a kind of radical act of generosity. And the membership is open. So if there are librarians who are interested or knowing more, please go to our website and check out the different tiers. You do have the option for governance. So there is shared governance with Lever. What you get is a say in the process and in the finances. So both of the presses have faculty editorial boards that deal with the scholarly side of the publishing process. Lever has an oversight committee, which is comprised of librarians from the partner institutions, and they have a say in governance. And so that is very different than investing in a big traditional university press where you aren't going to have obviously a say in the publishing program or in the governance of the institution. And then the final word I'll say is about production costs. For direct production costs, we have about an average of $6,000 US. But that does not include things, for example, like the fulcrum fee per year per press. And so there are a lot of costs. It's very difficult, I think, especially with these shared models, to nail down some of the costs beyond the direct actual production costs themselves. We do, of course, get a lot of in-kind contributions from our host institutions. So Lever from Michigan, Amherst College Press from Amherst College. It's hard to quantify the overhead, right? So HR costs, IT, we rely on Amherst College. And so those are a bit difficult to calculate, even more so because we had shared staff at both the presses. But we are hoping now that we are teasing these two out, we'll be able to nail down some of those costs at a little bit more precision as well. But happy to answer, and there's a lot to cover with two presses in 10 minutes, so happy to answer any questions after.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I think you did have a tricky job to get through the two there. Thank you. And now we're going to be hearing from Julian Mccarty of Mattering Press, our next speaker.
Hey there, am I on?
Yeah, we can hear you, Julian.
Yeah, great. So I will not have slides, so no need to share my screen. I'm representing Mattering Press today, and I'm really happy to be here in this great company. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing and how it's financed or not financed, really. So we set Mattering Press in 2012 in the final stages of our PhDs as a group of PhD students that in one way or another, met at Lancaster University. And our starting point was really that in our field of science and technology studies, which really evolved around understanding how, how scientific truths are kind of put forward as universal by ignoring their conditions of production, really. And ignored that their production was actually always partial, and that they came around in particular privileged sites with particular tools and infrastructures by particular people, usually white men. And that kind of gaze that was turned on scientific production, weirdly enough, hadn't really been turned inward to the modes of production and the conditions of knowledge production within STS, the academy, more wildly. And so more practically, also, there was not really any open access book publishers in our field. So we set up Mattering Press to practice theory, if you like, because we believe that there's one way in which theory can actually make a difference. The press provided us with an opportunity to engage as scholars in a hands-on way with the practicalities and politics of publishing at once, which I think is really important to this work. So we believe that knowledge dissemination cannot be meaningfully separated from production, and that thinking both together is really important, politically, but also practically, which is why we are into scholar-led publishing, really. And if you're into this idea of publication being integral to research, I'm going to share a link to our publication Transmissions, Critical Tactics for Making and Communicating Research, in which we explore this further. Also, I'm saying we, by the way, but if any of my colleagues from Mattering are listening, they probably disagree with quite a few things I'm saying, so our we is not unified and not necessarily in agreement. But okay, so a year after we started in 2013, we registered the press in the UK as a charity. And so the press is run by an editorial board. We are Uli Beisel, Andre Dani, Anna Doric, Joe DeVille, Natalie Jill, Michaela Spencer, myself, and lots of love to you if you're listening. And all members of the board are also trustees of the charity. We are Diamond Open Access Press, so we make all our books available as ebooks, as HTML, and as PDFs. And I think this is really important because I think providing only PDFs, as many of the larger commercial presses that recently moved into the open access space have done, severely impedes usability both by humans, readers, and by machines, ways of processing these texts across different platforms. Practically, the board supervises all aspects of the press, and I say supervise, but really we do the majority of the work, with the exception of typesetting, copy editing, proofreading, web development, and illustration, which is are areas for which we work with freelancers who are the only people who are paid. So our finances are opportunistic, really. So the bulk of income comes from fees charged to institutions for the production of our books. And I'm afraid to say that this is a variant of book processing charge, really. I'm also keen to say that this is not a business model. It's also not in alignment with our values, but it is an opportunistic way of interfacing with the system, that is itself changing and sucks in many ways. And what is important to us, though, is that our publishing decisions are independent of the ability of an author to access institutional funds. And in that, I align with Francois, really. I have some questions about that. So we charge a kind of a flat fee of £6,000. And our bare bones production cost is on average £2,500. But that excludes a vast majority of labor that is hidden away in pockets here and there. And I will come back to that, but I think that's a really important point, particularly if you talk about business models. So we're currently working with an alliance of other scholar-led presses that we have recently formalized as an association, registered in the Netherlands. And with them, we're working on setting up a collective library scheme that if it is successful, will provide a way for smaller presses to be supported by libraries, presses that don't have the capacity to build their own library programs. And I think what is really important about that, both that it allows institutions that actually want to work together to interface. Libraries cannot actually very easily recognize small publishers and therefore cannot support them even if they want to. And I think it's also important that this is a model of collaboration for public good. That is precisely not a business model, but a recognition of productive capacity, relationships, and collectivity. And therefore, links to public good rather than the idea of business. And I think that is really important as an organizational framework, really. So we are really happy to share the way we organize ourselves and our modest financial flows in more detail. And I'm really glad that this collection exists. But I want to use the rest of my time to talk a little bit. I mean, you can look it up on the post. Think a little bit more about this idea of business model, because since we started, we've been asked many times what our business model is. And this question really never fails to irritate me, because I think it's a question that comes with an enormous baggage. It usually is, it's perfectly naturalized, even in otherwise highly reflexive company. It's a question that speaks, I think, to the seed from which Mattering Press kind of started, namely the notion that publishing is political and that we have to practice our theory if it's going to be worth anything at all. And I think it's important to hold that the idea of a business model is quite a recent invention, and one that came into circulation with the practice of pitching for venture capital investment, which required the fantasy, the risk of investments, the risk on return of investment could be modeled. So it's really bound up with a very particular economic vision. The idea that, there can be a model of how individual needs and commercial flows can align. And that didn't really exist until recently, that idea of modeling a business, and whether it's any good for business is a different question. But I think it's being quite thoughtlessly imposed on organizations of any kind, including those that serve public interest or funded overwhelmingly with public money, and both of which implies, to academic publishing in one way or another, however that money flows. And I think in our context, the question also implies that academic publishing and book publishing can reasonably be considered as business. And for many reasons we can discuss, I think it's really important to stress that academic publishing, with the exception of a minute subset of popular academic titles, has never really been and can never really be a viable business, because it depends entirely on public funds and the donation of labor and self-explanation and love, really. That is neither paid or if it is paid, then through public institutions. So I think further, the question of business model kind of implies or naturalizes ideas that publishers have to become sustainable, that they have to grow. And neither of these two things are really obvious to me. Even though I'm feeling their pull, on a daily basis, we have to grow, we have to, so. And I think it also implies that models of business or otherwise have a sort of deeper connection to reality than the peer relationships, call it human connection, and the joy of making things that we all know is absolutely essential at all stages of bookmaking, which in the end is an insanely labor-intensive process, that is totally out of proportion, especially for academic books, which are read by so few people, let's face it. So if there is no collective making and coming together in the process of making them, then it's quite hard to actually justify making them at all, which brings us to also the insight there is not one model, and that models generally cannot really contain the deeper reasons, motivations that drive people to do this work despite everything. And I really insist that this is not like the emotions and so our body's desires. These are not nice to have, so add-ons, but actually what makes the model work, despite that's the kit that bridges all the stuff that wouldn't work in a model otherwise. So slightly shifting towards the end of my contribution, we have actually begun to run business as usual after a while. So the political questions we set out of practice have become less attention. And the reasons why we were involved in the first time got more or less airtime also internally. We really had business meetings, getting stuff done, running at the press like a business, get books done, become better at all the stuff, metadata, recoverability, distribution, preservation, accessibility, and so on and so on. And we recently just decided to kind of change tracks, and we stopped having business meetings, and we slowed down. And started a few months ago, and it's quite exciting. We starting from the premise that we actually do not need to do anything at all, and there's two things that I want to say that came out of this so far. One is that since we were PhD students, our path have stratified considerably. So we occupy very different positions now within the academic system, from like marginal relationships to the precarious employment of the lower ranks to fully established lifelong professorial lordship. And one of the things that really struck me is that within our group, the alienation with the academy is shared, no matter what the position within the system is. And that people like to work at Mattering Press because it provides a different intellectual space and a relational space from that of the contemporary university. And that I think there is something to think about, that academic books, like artist books used to, can provide an alternative space and half outside of the academy with different logics. And that is actually one of the reasons why academics engage in bookmaking, even if they don't always count towards CVs in the same way as articles do. And I think what we're doing in these meetings, we're moving slowly back from questions of business model, really, which sneaked in, can I say, to thinking about what model of collaboration and modes of relating, what kinds of relationships you want to pursue, really, which feels absolutely spot on. And of course, it includes financial flows, but I would really like to invite us to not think about them in terms of business, but to think about them of what kinds of models of collective production we can come up with that do justice to both the labor it takes and the insight that in the end, this is always going to be vastly subsidized by public money. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. And I particularly appreciated the way that you kind of interrogated, the idea and the usefulness of the business model as a concept. And I think it struck a bit of a chord in some of the attendees as well. And finally, last but not least, Vincent van Gerven of Punctum Books. Take it away, Vincent.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Julian. Thanks also to the other presenters so far. I mean, thanks for pulling us back from this business model talk. I'm not sure whether I should actually give my talk now in the way that I prepared it, but when Julian was speaking, I had to think about recently so I'm Vincent from Punctum Books, and recently we redrafted our vision statement, and that I'm going to post a link here. Oh, that's a word. Let's see. And this redrafting of the vision statement, which I won't reiterate here, has been a process of several years, years in which we as a press really got to engage with other open access presses, including Julian's and more recently Francois and of course Lucy's press, through Scholar-led and through other collaborative engagements such as Compendium. And in a way, those engagements take place in these types of preset business type formats, right? Compendium is this huge grant, and you're dealing with this grant language. And so rewriting our vision statement, we really had to consciously pull back from this idea, 2 paragraphs of vision, like 10 mission points, and then, future avenue vision, or whatever they have, formalized and formulated as to what a foundation is supposed to do. And actually we drafted like 10 pages, and it's like our vision statement is 10 pages, and we say exactly how we feel about book publishing. And I just want to read one small thing that is an opening quote for my co-director Eileen, I think, which really resonates with what Julian just said. I'm going to read it here from the website. It ought to be the role of the public research university, and by extension of its platforms for disseminating research results, not to regulate and officiate thought, while also subjecting its potential publication to market and disciplinary conditions, but rather to create the hospitable, open conditions for its creative emergence beyond what we think we know, in whatever forms it might take. And I think this is also really capturing the Punctum publishing ethos, with which I am going to go to the presentation of what is still called a business model, insofar that I suppose it is also a business that we run, I guess, reluctantly in a way. So Punctum Books, how much time do I have? Maybe 6 more minutes. So we were established 10 years ago and incorporated as a public benefit corporation in California 7 years ago right now, or maybe what is it, 16? When is that? 6 years ago. We're scholar-led, we're queer-led. We call ourselves Sparkling Diamond Open Access because we think that all these terms are really kind of ridiculous. So we're Sparkling Diamond OA, and we're peer-reviewed. We don't have any mandatory BPCs, but we're opportunistic. We'll take your money if you have some. If your institution is rich, we'll take your money. Authors retain their copyright, and most of our books are published under the CC BY non-commercial share alike license, but we are open to authors choosing their own license for whatever part or part of the book they want. We're small, like the other presses here today. I don't know exactly how many FTE we are or how we would even calculate that. I think Eileen and I together are already more than 4 FTE, but I guess we have around 4 FTE, I suppose. We do between 30 and 40 publications a year, and we try to do everything in-house in the sense that we don't outsource anything. We have a fixed crew of freelance copy editors that help us with copy editing, but basically everything else is done in-house by us. We are a member of the Radical Open Access Collective. We're one of the founding members of Scholar-Led, and we are one of the partners in the Coping project that I won't talk about today too much. Our catalog, it's Humanities, Social Sciences, Arts, and Architecture, and that really reflects the interests of the directors. These are also the fields in which we have our own degrees and that we feel comfortable looking into. We highly value transdisciplinary research. We value experiments with content, style, and form. So we really like to pick up the weird books that are out there. We won't, you know, immediately be attracted to a standard scholarly monograph. We really want the thought to sizzle and to do fun things, and we want to be engaged by a book. And several of our publications have been shortlisted for some awards that we send them to now and then, and we probably should do a better job at, you know, at sending these books out. Actually, outreach, I think, and promotion is one of our main challenges as a press, because on the one hand, it is highly repetitive, right? You have to be in social media, you have to post these things, and you have to make small blurbs, and you have to reach out to God knows how many awards and how many reviewers. So it is repetitive and boring. At the same time, you can only do it when you have a really deep knowledge of the catalog and the publications. So while the work is boring, you actually do need an enormous amount of knowledge. And it's very difficult to find people that actually want to put in the work to, you know, absorb basically our entire catalog and everything that's in there, the authors, their biographies, what they're working on, you know, who they're working with, where they're at. And at the same time, you know, be on Twitter, which frankly speaking is just a bore. So the combination of these things makes it difficult to actually find people, you know, who are willing to do it. And so we do it ourselves. Our review process. So there, especially in the beginning of open access, there was a lot of talk about, oh, it's not reviewed and they just publish whatever. And I think also Beth kind of referred to these types of sentiments among faculty. We are, you know, peer reviewed. Actually, we're scholar-led, so we are part of the peers. We consider our authors our peers. We very often engage deeply with manuscripts on a scholarly level. We do all kinds of deep editing and long conversations about how manuscripts should be structured and formatted and thought through. So our process is that, you know, as some of the other presses, we have decoupled financial considerations from editorial considerations. So I don't care how much money we have or how much money you have. If we want a book, then we'll do it. So there's an initial review round by Eileen and me. We basically choose what we like. And in this sense, we're kind of more like a trade press. So we don't care that you are very important or that your book is apparently very important or very good. If we don't like it, we don't like it. So we make the first selection because we only want to publish something that we like. And then it goes through a review process, additional review process by members from the editorial board or external reviewers. This is a process that is collaborative with the author, right? So we don't do this kind of mythological double-blind peer review that in any case, we don't really believe in as an equitable method. We really tailor the review to the needs of the author or the editors in case of an edited book. Which I think is a much nicer process. It is open or blind, depending on what everybody wants. So it's consensual. And in our experience, the end results are much better because you actually have people collaborating on a book rather than, you know, reviewer two trying to save their own career. In 2020, I don't actually have the numbers of 2021 yet. It's too early in the year. In the spring, I'll have these. 2020, we did 36 titles. Probably we did around the same amount in last year. No. And the average cost is, I think, basically what the other presses have been saying as well, at least from the very specific numbers that Francois posted and my quick calculations from around $2. It is more or less in the same ballpark. I know that OBP also has similar types of pricing, so from the studies that they published. And, you know, we at some point were looking, we don't make these very specific calculations that Francois did, because every book is very different. And honestly, I don't want to spend any time on figuring out how much time I spent on X or Y. I don't keep my hours. I work until something is done. But I guess overall, this is the price of one of our average books, keeping in mind that no book is average, and some books, they fly out of the window, and other books are a 2-year-long grind. How do we do our distribution? We are also doing print on demand, like basically every other academic press at this moment in time. So things go out through Amazon and KDP. We recently signed a distribution contract, which is kind of really exciting, with Verity Books and Associates, which is a print book distribution company. So now we actually have to think about actual print book cycles and how bookstores think about these types of things. So we have to plan ahead. We have to make catalogs for the future, which is an exercise we've never really done. Like, a book is done when it's done. So now we have to structure ourselves. We have to discipline ourselves in a little bit more stringent way. I think we can do it. So, and it's just very exciting to have, the idea that the books would be out there in bookstores that we all love to visit and where we love to buy books. And then academic libraries can get our books through the Gobi YBP system, which is a whole different ecosystem of really weird ways of acquiring books. But they get books from us as well. Ebooks go through digital repositories such as OASPA and JSTOR and Project News. I was really interested actually in this graph that Beth showed about, how Fulcrum puts out all these books. And I think Lucy's OBP also has like a similar, very impressive system to push all these metadata formats and so on, and different data formats to all these different platforms. I think that this is one of the things we're trying to solve via Tote, which is one of the projects developed within the COPIM, a larger project. It's an open metadata management system that we use. I think Metering also uses, OBP also uses it. But it also tries to open up these types of disseminations, right? So that these types of, that it's easier for smaller presses to actually, get to this large distribution coverage, as you saw in this little Fulcrum image that Beth showed, that we try to democratize the access to these types of platforms, or maybe not democratize, but at least make them more accessible. I think democratization is really far away. Then maybe some numbers. These are the most recent numbers. So these are our book sales. So as you can see, we sell on average about like 500 books. There was a peak this month, or like last month, and we, for the first time, passed 1,000 print sales per month, which, we didn't know. I mean, I know why. It's just one book that is selling really well at the moment. So we're very happy about that. But I think on average about 500 copies. And there's like this really slow go. You see like this really deep pit at some point, 2020. That's Amazon calibrating the algorithms, right? So it also showed at the beginning of COVID. And so it also shows you how incredibly vulnerable all of this is to the vagrancies of, billion-dollar, predatory asshole companies, to which we are unfortunately kind of bound, because there's no other way to get our books, print on demand out into the world at such a large scale. So it's a really difficult position in that way. And as Beth said, ebook usage through these platforms is, so much more, and it's so much better, right? I mean, the access that we get, ever since we joined OASPA, and then also later JSTOR and Muse, really shows you that this is just the way to go to get books out into the world. Maybe not to very fashionable reviewers in all kinds of the right places, but definitely to readers that really need to read this in places that cannot have access to the print book, that cannot have access to like paywalls, but people that actually do want to do research, want to improve their lives and want to improve their countries. And I really think that this is, I mean, as Julien said, we are providing a public good, and it should be public, and all of academic literature should be considered a public good, as far as I'm concerned. In order to support all of this, or at least part of it, we have this supporting library membership program. We developed this together with UC Santa Barbara Library. This has been a really, really fruitful collaboration, also in terms of us learning from them and them learning from us. There's a pricing scheme. You'll get all kinds of things like metadata records and so on. But I think I'm a little bit over time, so I'm just going to skip this. If you're a librarian and you're interested in supporting punctum books, then obviously you can go to the little website that's over there. And I think, Lucy, that I should close off so we have some discussion time. So I'm just going to leave you with a bunch of links to our catalog. We publish all our financial reports online. We have our user statistics online, and again, the link to our library program, should you be interested. Thanks.
Thanks, Vincent. And thanks very much to all of the speakers. We've already got some questions, which is great. And I think maybe if we start by picking up on one of the points that Julian made, we have a question from Nancy who says, I agree with Julian about the use of the business model word. Should we look for other terminology first of all? So I wonder if maybe we could start with Beth and Francois answering that one, because Vincent, you had the chance to kind of reflect slightly on what Julian said in your presentation. Beth, would you like to go first?
I love that. I don't have the answer, but I like to always say that we're not market-based, that our currency is usage because we are library funded. So when somebody comes up with a good term to use, I'm happy to adopt it and use it. Because yeah, I think the focus should shift away from kind of just reproducing that corporate language, because we're all trying to do something radically different. But when we have to speak to our institutions, they want to know, what is your business plan, right? So like with Amazon, like with these other factors, we are subjected to, you know, the vocabulary of the worlds we are navigating in.
Yeah, thanks. Francois?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, some of us are lucky we don't have institutions that we have to report to, so we don't have to use that language. So in this case, we don't. So let's think of a better term. I mean, I think I agree with Beth that it's about how to find a sustainable way of disseminating as widely as possible. And the focus is always on the end part, not at the beginning part, and it's not on sales. So I think you need to shift that mindset, because a lot of people that approach us still think in those terms. I mean, I still have authors that can't believe that we can turn up to a conference and just put books out for people to take, you know, because the books have been paid for. We're not going to sell the books when they've already paid for them, you know. So, you know, this kind of thing, or at a seminar when they're students and they get books, this kind of shocks them in a way. And I think that's trying to get that message across, that it's about books in hands or downloads usage, not about sales and costs and business in the traditional sense.
Yeah, Eric suggested in the chat that we might think about impact model or something along those lines. And one of the things that I was trying to get across in the you know, my initial presentation of the collection, and that I might add in a bit more into the introductory text, is that we're trying to think about the, you know, the why as much as the how. So I think that speaks to that idea of impact as well, and kind of that you're not just presenting a model of how you can make something quote unquote sustainable, but why you want to do it and why you want to do it in that particular way. And I think Maria's also suggested sustainability model. Julian and Vincent, I can see both your hands. Julian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that obviously my presentation comes from being very particularly situated, no? So we do have some access to money, not very much. And I think like anyone's position here is kind of predicated by, you know, the circumstances under which they work. But what I think is maybe applies to all of us is how do you even make a point for, how do you say we are offering something that you cannot buy? Which is something we're thinking about in setting up this library scheme. All the books are already available. We are not one entity, but several. We're not in competition. We like to support each other. And we would like other people who work in this realm, in this case, librarians, to join the party. Yeah. And then how to even articulate that is really hard. And I think also to bring that element of collectivity, where business implies competition, it's really difficult to think through. And I think the language really matters. And then of course we have, you know, strategic use of bad language when we have to report to this or that entity. And I think there's also small windows of opportunity to change the profile or like the thing that we are doing, particularly if we're working together. And I think that's what kind of words can do maybe in this context.
Vincent?
I wanted to say something else, but now that I see the point, and since we have such short discussion time, maybe if I may reflect on the point that Bernie just posted from Sarah Johnson about the black and white thing about profit, non-profit. I completely agree. I think that there are non-profit actors that are highly predatory, and I think that there are for-profit actors that are actually pretty good players. Actually, in fact, I think Punctum Books is a public benefit corporation, which is somewhere, at least under California law, somewhere between a profit and non-profit. But we don't have an oversight board, nor would I ever want one. You know, Eileen and I want to make those choices about where the press goes, what we spend our money on, completely ourselves. This is our project, and we run it the way that we like it, and you know that's just how it's going to be. At the same time, we are very open about our finances. We are open about the way that we govern it, and you know, and in that sense, we're more like a standard non-profit. I mean, we publish these reports and we collaborate and so on. So I think that the attitude is much more important than, you know, your legal status. And as we've seen in the past, non-profits can be easily bought by profits and turned into something else. You know, keep a non-profit front, you know, towards the public, while actually, you know, being a venture capitalist project. So I would rather like to think about this, you know, in terms of like personal social interactions, rather than, you know, operating on this type of corporate level of juridical terminology. That's really not what it's about. And I don't think that that's actually the way to find sustainable partnerships, whatever that means, right? It is so much, and I think also this was pointed out before, so much about publishing works on this effective level. It is a relationship of care for authors, care for ourselves, that simply does not, or should not, ought not be modeled into these types of corporate languagescapes. So yes, agree with you, Sarah.
Francois, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, I mentioned the word ecosystem when I presented, and for me that is what it's about. It's an ecosystem. It can have profits or not for profits. It's not really about that so much. It's that the ecosystem itself is as healthy as possible. I don't think the ecosystem at the moment is necessarily all that healthy, and difference in that ecosystem is important. We don't want a commune. You know, we want diversity in an ecosystem. And to illustrate that point, just from our own experience, you know, we participate in a program by AU Presses, where we were invited to partner with a AU Press member, and our partner is Duke University Press. And I can't imagine two presses being more different than Duke University Press and African Minds. But we meet every month and we have great discussions. We're at very opposite ends of the spectrum, but that's a good thing. You know, we'll be learning quite a bit from each other. So that's just to kind of illustrate that point.
Thanks, Francois. There's a question from Stuart. Open platforms in other markets often offer channels for access to communities of users based on usage or interest. What considerations have the panel had about such models for OA rather than subscriptions by users or APCs, etc.? Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Vincent?
Well, the community of these users, right, is the university to a large extent, right? So we, you know, scholarly publishers are in this, you know, don't operate in this new, like a new tech startup or something. Like you basically create your user base with your app. That's not what we're doing. There is an existing, I cut these words. There are scholars that have, you know, existed for a rather long time. They have organized in different ways. The current research university is one of the more predatory ways in which they've organized, and they you know, they publish materials, and we and we distribute those materials back amongst them, right? So this is like the Renaissance idea of the Republic of the Letters. That is our user base. And so to imagine that any platform could capture that audience and somehow tie the audience back to the publishing is something that I think is highly undesirable. And that's precisely what, for example, Elsevier is trying to do with Scopus. I think it's incredibly undesirable for publishers to want to corral or bring together readers onto platforms. We produce books, and at least from the punctum perspective, these books are missives into the universe. I don't care where they end up as long as they just go somewhere. I don't need to know metrics. I don't need to know how many people read my books. I just want them to be out there because I think they're beautiful objects. But this is just true. And
I think as well, in terms of, the fact of them being open, I've sort of talked about this and written about this a little bit for OBP's usage statistics. And, there's the huge chunk that we can't measure precisely because, they are shared openly. I mean, Beth, you mentioned usage statistics in your presentation. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No.
But yeah, I think the fact that, we don't know to a large extent how our books are shared. So the extent to which we can measure, it gives us an indication of how much books are being used, maybe on particular platforms or relative to each other. But yeah, there's this kind of big grey area that precisely exists, it exists intentionally because the books are open, but makes it difficult maybe to adopt a model like that, perhaps. We have another question from Nancy. A question for the 4 speakers related to perceived bias against books published by your initiatives. Have any of you documented any sort of bias making it more difficult to circulate, disseminate, and/or cite or mention your publications? Does anybody have any thoughts about that one?
I mean, I document it in my heart when I hear things like from potential authors that is sort of when I was training our acquisitions editor, is sort of how to change that rhetoric and how to change the minds of the scholars themselves. Because we actually often get a lot of, we'll really want a project, we think it's perfect for OA, it's perfect for our lists, and we really have to do a ton of convincing. It's almost like this sales relationship in some ways, but I haven't, and I guess I can say that we do have a freelance marketing and publicity coordinator, and I can say sometimes for reviews or other places there has been some bias, but we do or requiring an actual print copy of a book for awards and reviews, and we do make those available. So I could see it being a problem with other presses who don't do POD necessarily. Or for digital projects, we have some where we won't do a print.
Vincent, did you want to come in there as well?
Yeah, unless either maybe Francois or Julien, because I talk a lot.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly that I echo what Beth said. The problem is more on the author side than on the promotion or acceptance side. So authors, and it's interesting, when we started this, we really thought we'd get a lot of young authors because they would buy into the philosophy and the approach, but it's actually the opposite. Most of our authors are quite old because they have funding and they don't care anymore about reputational economy. So the younger authors are still locked into that, and they have to publish with certain publishers that they see as important on their CVs. So that's something we still struggle against all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do recognize what Francois said. Actually, these are also changing, like as the press gets older. So when we started out, it was basically, as Francois described, like a bunch of older scholars, late career, they don't care anymore. Like, I love what you're doing with your press. Here, have this book. It's a crazy book. I cannot put it anywhere else, but you probably will like this type of thing. And so we got a lot of these types of books, plus books from basically, you could say, totally disaffected scholars who no longer believe in the, either the university or publishing system, that say, I really believe that A, my book should be open access, and B, that the way that I write has really no place in the modern academia. So maybe you would be interested in this type of approach to certain theoretical issues. And so these were the two basically rather, opposite side of books. But as we grew and as our catalog grew, we have seen an increase, in first publications, tenure books, mid-career scholars. But this is a long process onto which, we hardly have any influence. The only influence we have is publishing more books and growing a catalog that is attractive to authors to be part of. And the only way you can do that is by growing your catalog. Like, there's no PR campaign that you can throw against that.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. And I'm conscious that we're running over time slightly. So, Julien, do you want to make your point there?
Yeah, we'll make it brief. I mean, we have seen similar developments, but I think what is just as a scholar-led press, people actually do really value to publish with us for the kind of relationships that we try to enact. And sometimes we get it really wrong. You know, it's not that it always works, you know, harmoniously, but generally the feedback is that, you know, producing a different kind of scholarship by making different kinds of publications is really valued, and we see uptake from that.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you to all of the questioners for some great questions. I get the feeling we could probably have carried on talking for another half an hour, which is also testament to the great presentation. So thank you very much to the panel and to everyone for your contributions. Just to reiterate again that the business model case studies, if we still want to call them business model case studies, from all the presses who spoke today are available on the PubPub, along with case studies from other presses. And as I said, we're interested in more contributions if you'd like to contribute. And thanks to OASPA as well for hosting. And also on behalf of OASPA, thanks to the sponsors of the webinar today. Thanks everyone very much.